We're talking about biblical scholar Bart Ehrman and some of his more popular books right now. First of all, his new one, Jesus Interrupted, but then also Misquoting Jesus, really calls into question a lot of the fundamental things about the New Testament and the accuracy of the Bible. And Mike, one of the charges he makes is that some of the books of the New Testament are just out and out forgeries. Why does he make that? What's his evidence that he shows for that?
Well, I think he says like 18 or 19 of them are forgeries of the 27 books and letters in the New Testament. And well, that is a gross overstatement. It's, I think it's made for shock value, and he knows that. Biblical scholars over time, New Testament scholars have disagreed or debated on the authorship of a number of the books and letters in the New Testament. It'd be a lot to get into all of them, so if it's okay with you, I'll just focus on the four Gospels.
Sure.
The argument that he gives for that is that the four Gospels are anonymous insofar as in the original manuscripts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they don't have the title on there that says the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, to Luke, to John, as we find in our New Testaments today. And he says the original manuscripts didn't have those titles on there, and nowhere within the body of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John do we find them as claiming to be the authors, like I, Matthew, wrote this, etc. So it says they're anonymous, and we really don't have any idea who wrote them. So he says they're forgeries.
Well, so what do you make of his arguments? What do you think?
Today, the majority of scholars, and I'm not talking about 90%, I'm saying more scholars than not, probably 55, 60%, would accept the traditional authorship of Mark and Luke. And even in antiquity, the earliest Christian sources report that Mark was not an eyewitness. He didn't follow Jesus or see him, but that he did accompany Peter, and that he wrote down the recollections of Peter. And Peter's the lead apostle of the church, so that's pretty strong. Luke, it's never claimed that he was an eyewitness, but you have Irenaeus in the 2nd century and others who say, and Justin Martyr around the middle of the 2nd century, who say that he accompanied Paul. And Luke himself never claimed to be an eyewitness, but if you look at the first 4 verses in his gospel, he says that he went to the eyewitnesses and spoke and interviewed those. The academic term for that would be autopsy. He wanted eyewitness testimony. And so he goes to them and to the actual eyewitnesses. And Luke is known as a pretty good historian. He followed very carefully the standards of the 1st century to do proper historiography. So he's going with the eyewitnesses. So we have eyewitness testimony in Mark from Peter. We have eyewitness testimony in Luke from the apostles themselves, possibly even from Paul in his sequel, which is Acts. And again, more scholars than not. A small majority, though, accept the traditional authorship of Mark and Luke, and that's including skeptical scholars. When we come to Matthew and John, it gets a little more fuzzy. Matthew is the most hotly disputed of the 4 Gospels in terms of who wrote it and the traditional authorship. But, like Papias, who's writing around the year 120, 125, he even reports about Matthew being the apostle who wrote it. And you even have prominent scholars like I. Howard Marshall, Scott McKnight, Joel Green, who say that it's a reasonable position for the traditional authorship of Matthew. John is disputed among scholars. It has been for some time. Some say that he was John the Apostle. That's the most traditional view. But some say the beloved disciple was an actual disciple of Jesus. He wasn't one of the 12, but he was one that traveled with Jesus, a minor disciple, and he was an eyewitness. And if they dispute whether he wrote it or whether some of his disciples wrote it. But either way, you've got eyewitness testimony in it. So even James D.G. Dunn, just within the last couple of months here in 2009, in his most recent book, says that even Matthew and John, the most disputed of the traditional authorship of the 4 Gospels, he says the position of the traditional authorship deserves respect. And this is a major New Testament scholar who's saying this. So the thing is, it is not a foregone foregone conclusion that no one knows who wrote the Gospels. We can't establish it with a high degree of certainty, but it's debated certainly, but it's not like we don't have any idea who wrote these things. So
Right.
I really think it's misleading to call them forgeries.
I guess having scholars say it's a reasonable position to hold to the tradition is about as good as we can hope for with some of the New Testament scholars out there.